Right before my wedding day, I went to visit my future mother-in-law at her house. As I was leaving, I realized I forgot my coat. I walked back inside to grab it and instantly decided to call off the wedding right on the spot. My name is Nia, and at 32 years old, I had spent the last decade building a life completely separate from my family's expectations. Outwardly, I was the director of a small nonprofit providing financial counseling to women. In reality, I was the silent CEO of Vanguard Holdings, a quiet empire quietly acquiring prime real estate and distressed debt. But nobody knew that, certainly not my fiancé Marcus or his mother Vivian. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. And if you have ever had your family underestimate you, or if you have had to set hard boundaries with toxic relatives, hit that like and subscribe button. This journey is not for the faint of heart. The incident that shattered everything happened just 3 days before my $150,000 wedding. A wedding my family and Marcus had pressured me into financing through what they believed were high-interest loans. I had driven out to Vivian's house in Alpharetta. It was one of those massive, imposing homes that looked beautiful on the outside but always felt cold the moment you stepped through the door. I was there to drop off the final batch of wedding invitations. Vivian had greeted me with her usual brittle smile, offering a cup of tea while making pointed comments about my modest car and my simple clothes. I had smiled and nodded, playing the role of the meek, socially awkward nonprofit worker she expected me to be. After a strained hour, I finally excused myself, claiming I needed to prepare for the rehearsal dinner the next day. I walked out to my car, started the engine, and realized my favorite cashmere coat was missing. It was a chilly November afternoon, so I quickly headed back to the house. The front door was slightly ajar. I must not have pulled it shut properly when I left. I stepped into the foyer, the heavy wood floors dampening the sound of my footsteps. I was halfway to the living room when I heard their voices coming from the kitchen. "You have to make sure she signs that prenuptial agreement tomorrow." Vivian's voice was sharp, stripped of the syrupy sweetness she used around me. Her little charity might be practically bankrupt, but that trust fund her grandmother left her is not. I froze, my hand hovering over the back of the sofa where my coat was draped. The trust fund. My grandmother had left me a substantial trust when I had carefully protected and grown into Vanguard Holdings. I had mentioned it to Marcus early in our relationship, downplaying its size, but clearly he had shared that information with his mother. "Once you are married, Marcus, you use that trust to clear Chloe's debts," Vivian continued, her voice echoing slightly in the large kitchen. "Brad is in deep with those crypto loans, real deep. We have to save Chloe. She is the one who actually belongs in our circle. She is the perfect daughter-in-law for a family like ours, not this plain, boring girl. Chloe, my younger sister, the golden child of the Washington family. The social media influencer who never missed a chance to put me down. And Brad, her white, arrogant husband, who constantly bragged about his crypto investments. They were drowning in debt, and Vivian wanted to use my money to save them, because Chloe was the perfect daughter-in-law." A sick feeling washed over me, a familiar tightening in my chest. It was the same feeling I had when my parents forced me to give up my college scholarship so they could pay for Chloe's pageant coaching. I heard Marcus laugh. It was a cold, calculating sound that made my blood run cold. "Do not worry, Mom. She is desperate for this wedding. She is so grateful I even looked at her. After we say I do, I will convince her to leverage the trust for an investment. I will spin some story about our future. Chloe and Brad will be fine. Chloe will not embarrass her new family." My breath hitched. The man I was supposed to marry in 3 days. The man who had held me and told me he loved my passion for helping others. He was planning to steal my inheritance to pay off my sister's husband's gambling debts. He thought I was desperate. He thought I was blind. I didn't storm into the kitchen. I didn't scream or cry. I felt a sudden, absolute clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when the final illusion shatters. I reached out silently, picked up my coat from the sofa, and carefully, quietly backed out of the house. I pulled the front door shut, making sure it clicked perfectly into place. I walked to my car, my steps measured and calm. Once inside, I locked the doors and pulled out my phone. I didn't call Marcus. I opened our text thread and typed a simple message. Just got home. See you at the rehearsal dinner tomorrow. I hit send, my thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before I closed the app. Then I opened my contacts and found the name I needed, Tasha Davis. She was more than just my lawyer. She was the architect of Vanguard Holdings' legal structure, a woman whose sharpness matched my own. The phone rang twice before she answered. Nia. Everything okay? Tasha's voice was brisk and efficient. I took a deep breath, the cold air from the car vent bracing against my face. Tasha, I need you to initiate Plan B immediately. Plan B. Tasha paused, the professional tone shifting into high gear. You are sure? I am absolutely sure. I watched Vivian's house in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the driveway. I need Vanguard Holdings to acquire all outstanding debt belonging to Brad and Marcus. Every loan, every credit line, every marker they have out there. I want it all. Consider it done, Tasha replied, her voice tightening with a mixture of concern and readiness. How much time do we have? The wedding is in 3 days. I want the paperwork ready by the ceremony. I want to own them completely. I hung up the phone and merged onto the highway. The tears I expected didn't come. Instead, a cold, hard resolve settled over me. They thought I was a naive charity worker they could easily manipulate. They thought my grandmother's trust was a piggy bank for their golden child. They were about to learn exactly who they were dealing with. The wedding was still happening, but the vows were going to be very, very different. The rehearsal dinner at a high-end Buckhead restaurant was exactly the kind of ostentatious display Vivian loved. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over arrangements of white orchids, and the air hummed with the quiet, practiced conversations of Atlanta's black elite. I sat at the head table, the supposed guest of honor, feeling completely detached from the spectacle unfolding around me. My mother, Clarice, sat to my right, her voice carrying over the gentle clinking of silverware. She had not stopped singing Marcus's praises since the first course arrived. We are just so blessed, Clarice announced to a table of Marcus's extended relatives. Marcus is doing so well at the firm. It is a relief really knowing Nia will finally have someone to take care of her. Her words were laced with the familiar condescension I had endured my entire life. Oh, Nia does her best, my mother continued, waving her hand dismissively. But you know how nonprofit work is. Very noble, but it hardly pays the bills. We always worried she would end up struggling, not like Chloe. Chloe, seated across the table, flashed a picture-perfect smile, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light. Beside her sat Brad, her husband. He leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Hey, if the charity thing goes under Nia, you can always come work for me. Brad offered, his tone dripping with arrogance. My crypto platform is expanding. I need someone to manage the social media accounts. You know, post some memes, keep the engagement up. It pays better than whatever you are doing now. The table erupted in polite laughter. My mother beamed at Brad, clearly viewing his insulting offer as a gesture of familial support. Marcus chuckled, placing a hand over mine, feigning affection, while implicitly agreeing with the mockery. I smiled back, a calm, measured expression. I thought about the conversation I had overheard just 24 hours earlier. I thought about the $5 million Brad had lost, the debt that was currently suffocating him. I thought about Marcus's plan to use my inheritance to bail him out. The irony was almost too delicious to bear. That is very generous of you, Brad, I said smoothly, but I think I will stick to what I know. Vivian, seated on Marcus's other side, cleared her throat. The noise at the table immediately died down. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it deliberately across the pristine white tablecloth until it rested directly in front of me. Nia, darling. Vivian began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I know this is a bit unconventional for a rehearsal dinner, but Marcus's lawyers insisted we get this out of the way before the ceremony. Just a formality, really. I looked down at the folder. The words prenuptial agreement were printed boldly across the top page. The room went silent. The timing was entirely intentional. A public setting surrounded by their wealthy friends and my approval-seeking parents, designed to pressure me into signing without question. My father, Pastor Thomas, leaned forward, his expression stern. It is for the best, Nia. Marcus has a substantial career to protect. In our circles, this is standard procedure. You understand. It was the same dynamic they had always used, presenting their demands as absolute necessities, framing my compliance as the only acceptable choice. 5 years ago, they had used the exact same tone when they told me to decline a full academic scholarship. Chloe needs a better launch pad, my mother had argued then. You are smart, Nia, you can figure it out. But Chloe needs the right connections to find a husband of her caliber. We need the tuition money to hire a pageant coach for her. I had swallowed my pride and taken out student loans, working 3 jobs to pay my way through college while Chloe paraded across stages in gowns paid for by my sacrifice. They had always treated me like an expendable resource, a stepping stone for the golden child. Now Vivian was trying the same tactic, using public pressure to secure her son's financial dominance. It just protects the assets Marcus has worked so hard to build. Vivian added, her eyes narrowing slightly, daring me to challenge her in front of the guests. We do not want any misunderstandings later. I didn't argue. I didn't ask to read the terms. I simply reached into my purse, retrieved a sleek silver pen, and flipped to the signature page. The swift motion sent a ripple of surprise around the table. Of course, Vivian, I said, my voice completely serene. I believe in protecting what we have built. I signed my name with a flourish, the ink gliding smoothly across the paper. I handed the folder back to her. Vivian snatched it up, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. My mother nodded approvingly while Chloe exchanged a knowing look with Brad. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured Marcus's wealth and boxed me out. They had absolutely no idea that by forcing me to sign that document, they had legally severed any claim Marcus would ever have to Vanguard Holdings. They had just protected my billion-dollar empire from his $3 million debt. Brad stood up, raising his bourbon glass, signaling for a toast. To Marcus and Nia, he declared loudly, and to family taking care of family. As the glasses clinked, I leaned slightly toward Brad, keeping my voice low so only he could hear. Speaking of taking care of family, Brad, I whispered, I hear the crypto market is brutal right now. FTX took a pretty hard hit last quarter. I certainly hope you haven't been leveraging any church assets to cover those margin calls. Brad froze his glass, hovering inches from his mouth. The color drained from his face so fast he looked ill. His eyes darted to my father, then back to me, sheer panic replacing his previous arrogance. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. I did not wait for his response. The real show was scheduled for tomorrow. The morning of the wedding arrived with a frantic, superficial energy that felt perfectly on brand for my family. The bridal suite at the country club was an explosion of white tulle champagne flutes and nervous chatter. The air was thick with hairspray and the scent of expensive lilies. I sat calmly in front of the vanity mirror, watching the makeup artist apply a final layer of setting powder. I looked at the reflection, noting the stark contrast in the room. My wedding dress hung neatly in the corner. It was elegant, understated, and completely overshadowed by the monstrosity hanging next to it. Chloe breezed into the room, bringing a gust of chaotic energy with her. She was already wearing her bridesmaid dress. To call it a bridesmaid dress was an insult to the concept of subtlety. It was a sequined, plunging, champagne-colored gown that looked more appropriate for a red carpet gala than a wedding where she was not the bride. She twirled in front of the full-length mirror, admiring her reflection with undisguised vanity. You know, Nia, I was actually surprised when Marcus proposed to you, Chloe said, her voice carrying that familiar syrupy condescension. I mean, with your little non-profit job and all, I figured you would end up marrying some boring accountant. But Marcus, he is a catch. He is doing so well. I dismissed the makeup artist with a polite thank you and turned in my chair to face my sister. She was still admiring her reflection, running a hand over the tight bodice of her dress. He is definitely something, I agreed, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Chloe laughed, a sharp, tinkling sound. He told Brad last night that he feels sorry for you sometimes. You know how hard you work for those poor women at your charity. He said you needed someone to finally take care of you. She walked over to my vanity and picked up a tube of lipstick, examining the color critically before tossing it back down. "Oh, and he mentioned the house," she added casually as if delivering the weather report. "Marcus said that since you two will be moving into his place, it makes sense to transfer the deed of Grandma's house to Brad and me. Just to avoid any complicated tax issues down the line, of course." The audacity was breathtaking. They were planning to steal my grandmother's house, the only piece of property left in my name that wasn't tied to Vanguard Holdings, and frame it as a favor. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs. "Transfer the deed," I repeated, my voice devoid of emotion. "To avoid tax issues." "Exactly?" Chloe beamed, finally looking away from the mirror to look at me. "It is just practical, Nia. Brad needs a clean asset on paper for his next crypto venture. And honestly, it is the least you can do. You barely use the place anyway." The entitlement radiating from her was suffocating. It transported me back 5 years to a cramped hospital room. I had been recovering from a severe car accident, my leg shattered. The insurance payout was substantial, meant to cover my extensive physical therapy. My parents had walked into that hospital room not with flowers or comfort, but with a demand. They had insisted I sign over half the settlement to Chloe. She needed the money for pageant coaching and a breast augmentation to secure her spot in the Miss Georgia competition. When I refused, they had called me selfish. They said I was ruining her future because I was bitter about my own injuries. I looked at Chloe now, standing in her ridiculous dress paid for by the very pageant success built on my suffering. "Just like it was practical for me to fund your pageant dreams with my settlement money," I said softly. Chloe's smile vanished. Her eyes hardened, revealing the viciousness she usually kept hidden behind her influencer persona. "Oh, get over it, Nia. That was 5 years ago. And look where it got me. I married Brad. He is a successful investor. We are building a life you could only dream of. You should be grateful I even agreed to be in this wedding. I only did it because Marcus asked me to. He knows I deserve to be surrounded by people who actually understand our lifestyle. You are lucky he is willing to elevate you." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I slowly picked up my diamond earrings from the vanity table and began fastening them. "You are right, Chloe," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You do deserve to be surrounded by people who understand your lifestyle." I reached into the small silk clutch resting on the table. My fingers closed around the cold, smooth metal of a silver USB drive. I stood up, smoothing the front of my silk robe, and walked over to her. I took her perfectly manicured hand and pressed the drive into her palm. "What is this?" Chloe asked, looking down at the drive with a mixture of confusion and disgust. "Consider it an early wedding gift from me to you," I said, maintaining eye contact. "It is a recording from Marcus's office yesterday afternoon. Your successful investor husband Brad was crying, actually sobbing. He was begging Marcus for a $2 million bridge loan because his crypto exchange is a complete fraud, and the people he owes money to are threatening to break his legs." Chloe stared at me, the color draining from her face so fast she looked like she might faint. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I suggest you find a laptop and listen to it before you walk down that aisle," I added softly. "Just so you know exactly how rich your husband really is." I turned back to the mirror, adjusting a stray curl. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Chloe's ragged breathing. She clutched the USB drive so tightly her knuckles turned white, her perfect facade cracking into 1,000 pieces. My mother rushed into the bridal suite first, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. Clarice Washington was a woman who lived for appearances, her perfectly coiffed hair and tailored suit, a testament to decades spent playing the devoted pastor's wife. My father, Pastor Thomas, followed close behind. He was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, accustomed to commanding a room with a single look. They found Chloe crumpled on the velvet settee, sobbing hysterically. The USB drive clutched against her chest like a lifeline. She played the victim with Oscar-worthy precision, gasping for air and pointing a trembling finger at me. "She is ruining everything," Chloe wailed, her voice thick with manufactured grief. She is trying to destroy my marriage. My father did not ask what happened. He did not ask what was on the drive. He did not ask his eldest daughter, standing quietly in her silk robe 2 hours before her wedding, if she was okay. He simply reacted to the disruption of his carefully curated family image. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. The air shifted as he loomed over me, his face dark with fury. He raised his hand, the heavy gold ring he wore catching the light, and for a split second I thought he was going to strike me. He stopped short, but the threat hung heavy in the air, a physical manifestation of the control he had always exerted. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to that booming, authoritative register he used from the pulpit. "Your sister is in tears on your wedding day. Apologize to her immediately." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The fear and desperate need for his approval that had defined my childhood were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. "I will not apologize for giving her the truth," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Brad is broke. He lost $5 million of other people's money. He was begging Marcus for a bailout yesterday." Clarice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She rushed over to comfort Chloe, casting a venomous glare in my direction. "You are lying!" Clarice snapped, her voice shrill. "Brad is a successful investor. He just bought Chloe that new Mercedes." "You are just jealous, Nia. You have always been jealous of her happiness. You cannot stand the thought of her having a better life than you." I looked at my mother, marveling at her capacity for delusion. She would rather believe a comfortable lie than face an ugly truth, especially if that truth threatened the social standing she had spent her life cultivating. "I am not jealous, Mom," I replied, picking up a folder from my vanity table. "I am informed." I pulled out a stack of papers and tossed them onto the coffee table in front of them. The thick packet landed with a heavy thud. "Those are Brad's financial records." I continued, watching my father's eyes dart toward the papers. Foreclosure notices on his investment properties, margin calls from 3 different brokerages, and a very interesting email thread with an offshore lender threatening to seize his assets. He didn't buy that Mercedes. He leased it under a shell company that is currently being audited. Chloe stopped crying, her eyes widening in genuine panic as she looked at the documents. My father, however, refused to even glance at them. His pride would not allow it. He squared his shoulders, his jaw tight. "I do not care what garbage you have fabricated, Nia," he growled. "You are not going to embarrass this family. The Jenkins are important people in this community. Vivian and her husband sit on the board of 3 major charities. Marcus is a highly respected financial advisor. We are not going to lose this connection because of your petty sibling rivalry." I took a step closer to him, closing the distance. "You mean you are not going to lose this connection because you need Marcus's supposed wealth to cover your own tracks?" My father stiffened, a flicker of genuine shock breaking through his anger. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the church," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am talking about the expansion fund. The $300,000 you handed over to Brad last month to invest in his latest crypto scheme." The silence in the room was absolute. Clarice stopped fussing over Chloe, her face turning chalk white. Chloe shrank back against the settee, suddenly looking very small. "How did you know about that?" my father demanded, his voice barely audible. "It does not matter how I know. What matters is that the money is gone. Brad lost it all. And now you are hoping Marcus will somehow bail you out so the church elders do not find out you gambled away the congregation's money. You know nothing." My father roared, his composure shattering completely. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You are a bitter, spiteful girl. You have always been a disappointment. You sit in that tiny office, pretending to save the world, while your sister actually builds a life. You will apologize to Chloe, you will put on that dress, and you will walk down that aisle and marry Marcus. Or so help me God. You are no longer my daughter." I looked at the man who had raised me, the man who was willing to sell me out to cover his own embezzlement. I felt a profound sense of liberation. The invisible chains that had bound me to this toxic dynamic were finally broken. I smiled. It was a small, cold smile that clearly unnerved him. That works for me, I said, turning my back on him. I picked up my clutch and headed for the door. Where do you think you are going? He shouted after me. If you walk out that door without apologizing, you are dead to this family. I paused with my hand on the brass doorknob. I turned back to face them, my gaze sweeping over my mother's pale face, Chloe's terrified expression, and my father's furious, desperate eyes. I am not walking out. I am going to the sanctuary. I have an announcement to make to our guests. I opened the heavy oak door. Great. See you in court, Pastor. The heavy oak door of the bridal suite clicked shut behind me, severing the hysterical sounds of my mother and the frantic shouting of my father. The sudden silence of the country club corridor was deafening. I stood there for a fraction of a second, feeling the immense physical weight of my custom silk wedding gown. It was a dress designed to make me look like a compliant traditional bride, a garment chosen specifically to appease Vivian Jenkins and Clarice Washington. Now the heavy fabric and the tight corset felt like battle armor. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy air conditioning cool my skin. I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble. The naive, people-pleasing woman who had walked into that room 20 minutes ago no longer existed. I began to walk. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with towering floral arrangements that I had paid for with my own hidden funds, while pretending to struggle with the cost to maintain my cover. My heels struck the polished hardwood floor in a steady, relentless rhythm. It was the sound of a countdown. As I approached the grand double doors leading into the main sanctuary, the wedding coordinator, a frantic woman tightly gripping a headset, rushed toward me. Her eyes were wide with sheer panic. She frantically waved her hands, signaling that it was not time, that my father had not yet emerged to escort me, that the string quartet had not even cued the bridal chorus. I did not stop. I simply looked at her with a gaze so incredibly cold she instinctively stepped back, pressing herself against the wall to let me pass. I pushed open the heavy double doors myself. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of excessive wealth and desperate social climbing. Over 300 guests were seated in gilded chairs. Atlanta's black elite, prominent local politicians, wealthy business owners, and the highest-ranking officials from my father's megachurch filled the room. Their silk suits and diamond necklaces shimmered under the massive crystal chandeliers. They were all murmuring politely, fanning themselves with custom-printed programs, waiting for the grand spectacle to begin. I stepped into the aisle. There was no music, no dramatic lighting shift, just me walking alone in a blindingly white dress. The effect was immediate. The polite chatter in the back rows abruptly died down, replaced by a wave of confused silence that rippled forward like a falling line of dominoes. Heads turned, hundreds of eyes locked onto me. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders pushed back, my chin held high. I did not look at the guests. I did not acknowledge the gasps or the frantic whispering that began to erupt as people realized I was walking down the aisle entirely alone, without the pastor, without the bridal party, and without the traditional wedding march. My focus was locked entirely on the front of the room. Standing beneath a massive, sprawling archway of imported white roses was Marcus. From 50 feet away, he looked like the absolute perfect groom. His tailored tuxedo fit him flawlessly, his posture radiating that signature Jenkins arrogance. But as I drew closer, the confident, camera-ready smile on his face began to fracture. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the empty space behind me, clearly looking for my father, for Chloe, for anyone who could explain why the script was suddenly changing. He looked at the coordinator standing in the back doorway, but she only offered a helpless shrug. Seated in the front row, Vivian Jenkins was a study in rapidly deteriorating composure. She was wearing a custom emerald green gown, sitting with the regal stiffness of a queen expecting a coronation. When she saw me marching down the aisle alone, her polite society smile completely vanished. She leaned forward, gripping her jeweled clutch so tightly her knuckles blanched. I could see the exact moment the realization hit her that she was no longer in control of the narrative. She exchanged a frantic, panicked look with Marcus, who was now visibly sweating under the bright altar lights. The murmurs in the room grew louder, swelling from polite confusion into an undeniable buzz of scandal. I could hear fragments of their whispers as I glided past the silk-draped chairs. Where is her father? Why is she walking alone? What is going on? The tension in the air was so thick it was suffocating, but to me it felt like oxygen. For the first time in my entire life, I was the one dictating the atmosphere. I was not the victim of their expectations. I was the architect of their ruin. I reached the end of the White Runner. Marcus stepped forward, extending his hand toward me, desperately trying to salvage the optics for the hundreds of people watching. His smile was painfully forced, stretching his cheeks into a rigid grimace. He expected me to take his hand. He expected me to fall into the role of the devoted, desperate bride he and his mother had laughed about in their kitchen. I did not even break my stride. I walked right past his outstretched hand. I bypassed the floral archway entirely. Instead, I stepped up onto the raised dais and walked directly to the pastor's podium. The collective gasp from the 300 guests was audible. The room plunged into a state of absolute electrified shock. Marcus spun around, his polished facade finally breaking. He lunged toward the podium, grabbing my arm. His grip was tight, a physical manifestation of his desperation to maintain his pristine public image. He plastered a fake, reassuring smile on his face for the benefit of the front row, pretending he was merely comforting a nervous bride. "Darling, what are you doing?" he hissed through clenched teeth, keeping his back to the audience so they could not see the panic twisting his features. His voice was a frantic, urgent whisper. "You are embarrassing us. Where is your father? Get down from here right now before you ruin everything." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. Then I looked up into his eyes, stripping away every ounce of warmth, every ounce of the naive affection he thought I harbored for him. "Take your hand off me, Marcus," I said. My voice was low, but it cut through his panic like a surgical blade. He blinked, genuinely stunned by the absolute authority in my tone. For a second, the arrogant, calculating man I had overheard in the kitchen surfaced. "You are having an episode, Nia," he growled, his grip tightening marginally. "I am not playing this game with you. Smile for the cameras and step down right now." I did not raise my voice. I simply held his gaze, my expression completely deadpan. "I own your debt, Marcus. Every single penny of it. If you do not let go of my arm this exact second, I will ruin you before the appetizers are even served." Marcus recoiled as if he had been burned. His hand dropped from my arm instantly. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. He stumbled back a step, his mind clearly racing as he tried to comprehend what I had just said and how I could possibly know about his financial devastation. He looked toward his mother in the front row, looking completely helpless. Vivian was frozen, her mouth slightly open in horror. I turned my attention to the podium. I reached out and tapped the microphone. A sharp, piercing burst of feedback echoed through the grand ballroom. The sound sliced through the frantic whispering, instantly commanding the attention of every single person in the room. 300 pairs of eyes were locked onto me, waiting with bated breath for the spectacle to unfold. I looked out over the sea of guests. I saw prominent judges, wealthy investors, and church elders who had judged me my entire life. I saw Vivian Jenkins practically vibrating with silent rage in the front row, and in the back of the room I saw the heavy oak doors swing open as my father, my mother, and Chloe finally rushed into the ballroom looking completely frantic. They froze in the doorway, staring in horror as they realized I had actually made it to the microphone. They were too late. The stage was mine. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing crystal clear off the vaulted ceilings. "Thank you everyone for coming today." I began, my tone calm, conversational, and entirely devoid of sorrow. "I know many of you traveled a great distance to be here, and I appreciate the effort you made to witness this union." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the tension to build until it was almost unbearable. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I glanced at Marcus, who was standing frozen just a few feet away, looking like a man waiting for the executioner to pull the lever. "This wedding cost exactly $150,000. I continued, my voice echoing across the room. The floral arrangements, the champagne, the custom seating, all meticulously planned to celebrate a merger of two prominent families. But I have an important update regarding the schedule of events. I looked directly at Vivian Jenkins, holding her furious, terrified gaze. I declare, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality, this wedding is officially cancelled. The ballroom exploded. It was not a murmur this time. It was a deafening roar. Over 300 guests erupted into shouts, gasps, and frantic conversation. Chairs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as people stood up in shock. In the front row, Vivian Jenkins looked like she was about to suffer a medical emergency. At the back of the room, my father stopped dead in his tracks, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. I stood at the podium, perfectly still amidst the absolute chaos I had just unleashed, feeling completely and utterly free. Vivian Jenkins was on her feet before the echoes of my cancellation had even died down. Her face was contorted in a mask of absolute fury, the carefully cultivated image of the genteel matriarch instantly replaced by the vicious predator she truly was. "Security!" Vivian shrieked, her voice shrill and unhinged, cutting through the rising clamor of the guests. "Get her down from there. She is having a psychotic break. Get her out of my sight." Two burly men in dark suits started moving from the side aisles, but they weren't moving toward me. They stepped squarely in front of Marcus and Vivian, crossing their arms. They were not the country club's security. They were my private detail hired the day before, instructed to ensure nobody interrupted my performance. Marcus tried to shove past them, his face frantic. "Move! That is my fiancé!" he yelled, his voice cracking. I looked past him, locking eyes with the audio technician stationed in the booth at the back of the room, a young guy I had tipped very generously. I gave him a curt, sharp nod. The chaos in the room was instantly silenced as a voice boomed from the state-of-the-art sound system. It was not my voice. It was Vivian's. "You have to make sure you force Nia to sign that prenuptial agreement tomorrow night at the rehearsal dinner." The recording was pristine. Every harsh, calculating syllable echoed off the vaulted ceilings and gilded walls. The 300 guests sat in stunned, electrified silence. "Her little nonprofit is practically bankrupt." Vivian's recorded voice sneered. "But that trust fund her grandmother left her is massive. You marry her on Friday. By Monday, you convince her to liquidate that trust to clear Chloe's debts." A collective gasp swept through the room. I watched as the prominent judges, the wealthy investors, and the church elders turned their shocked gazes from me to Vivian. She had frozen in place, her mouth hanging open, the color draining from her face so rapidly she looked like a corpse in a designer gown. Marcus was frantically looking around, searching for a way to stop the audio, but my security detail held him firmly in place. "I will spin some story about using the trust to invest in our future together." Marcus's recorded voice chimed in, smooth and utterly remorseless. "She is blind when it comes to me. Chloe and Brad will be completely bailed out by next week, and the Washington family will owe us forever." The audio cut out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. It lasted only a second before the room erupted again. This time it wasn't confusion. It was absolute outrage. The black elite of Atlanta were ruthless when it came to scandal, and they had just been given front-row seats to the destruction of the Jenkins family reputation. "Turn that off!" Vivian screamed, her voice breaking. "It is a fake. It is deep-fake audio. She is trying to ruin us." Marcus finally managed to break past one of the guards, launching himself toward the podium. "You vindictive psychotic!" He started to yell, reaching for the microphone. He didn't make it. The second guard intercepted him, tackling him to the polished floor with a sickening thud. Marcus hit the ground hard. His expensive tuxedo instantly rumpled, his dignity entirely stripped away. I stood over him, looking down at the man who had thought I was nothing more than a convenient bank account. My expression remained entirely neutral. "The truth is rarely psychotic, Marcus," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the microphone. "It is just incredibly inconvenient for liars." My father, Pastor Thomas, finally broke out of his paralyzed shock. He scrambled up onto the dais, his face a terrifying mix of rage and desperation. He ignored Marcus struggling on the floor and marched directly toward me, attempting to wrestle the microphone from my hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," my father boomed, using his best pastoral projection to try and drown out the murmurs of the crowd. "Please forgive this terrible scene. My daughter is clearly unwell. The stress of the wedding. She is not in her right mind. We apologize for this horrific display. Please let us handle this privately." He grabbed my arm again, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear. "I told you, you are dead to me," he hissed, his eyes manic. "You have destroyed our family. You have ruined Chloe. You are nothing but a petty, jealous failure." I didn't try to pull away. I didn't flinch. I simply turned my head, bringing my face inches from his, ensuring the microphone picked up every word I was about to say. "You should be a lot more concerned about your own future. Pastor," I said, my voice steady and cold, "because if you do not take your hand off me right now, I will not just play the audio of Brad crying. I will project the financial records of your church expansion fund onto that massive screen behind you. The $300,000 you funneled into Brad's crypto scam." My father froze. His grip on my arm went entirely slack. The anger in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by sheer unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward, putting a safe distance between us, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. I turned back to the microphone, looking out at the sea of shocked faces. "This concludes today's scheduled programming," I announced calmly. "Please enjoy the open bar. The Jenkins family is paying for it." I stepped down from the podium and walked back down the aisle, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. I paused halfway down the white aisle runner. The heavy oak doors were just steps away, but leaving now would be a mercy they did not deserve. They needed to see exactly what they had tried to steal. I turned back to face the altar, raised my hand, and signaled the audiovisual technician in the balcony. The ballroom lights instantly plunged into darkness. A collective gasp swept through the 300 guests, followed by the rustling of expensive silk and the anxious shifting of chairs. Above the altar, the massive LED screens roared to life. They were supposed to play a curated romantic slideshow of Marcus and me, smiling on beaches and posing at charity galas. Instead, the screens flooded the room with a harsh, glaring red light. I lifted the wireless microphone to my lips. "For those of you who just arrived, welcome to the real financial presentation," I announced, my voice echoing off the walls. "Marcus Jenkins has spent the last 2 years selling you the image of a prodigy wealth manager. He sold my parents the illusion of absolute security. But let us look at the reality." The screens shifted, displaying a mosaic of bank statements, overdue notices, and severe leverage warnings. The numbers were highlighted in bright, undeniable crimson. $3 million in personal debt, I read aloud, watching the red light reflect off the horrified faces in the front rows. Multiple over-leveraged properties. Secret loans taken out from predatory lenders to maintain a lifestyle he could not afford. Marcus is not a financial genius. He is entirely bankrupt. The Atlanta elite gasped in unison. Whispers erupted into outright shouting. Vivian Jenkins covered her face with her hands, shrinking into her gilded chair as if trying to physically disappear. Marcus was still on the floor, restrained by my security, staring up at the glowing red numbers, illuminating his total ruin. "You are insane!" a voice shrieked. Chloe could not handle the silence. She stormed down the side aisle, her plunging champagne gown sparkling under the red glow of the screens. She pushed her way to the front, her face contorted with panic and fury. She could not stand the spotlight being on anyone else, and she desperately needed to protect the illusion of her own perfect life. "This is a complete setup," Chloe screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You forged these documents. Marcus is wealthy. Brad is wealthy. You are just a pathetic, jealous loser who cannot stand that I have a real man who provides for me. Brad is worth 10 times whatever garbage you put on that screen." I smiled. It was a tight, controlled expression that made Chloe falter for a fraction of a second. "I am so glad you brought up your husband, Chloe," I replied smoothly. "Let us take a look at the white knight of the Washington family." I clicked the remote in my hand. The screens behind the altar wiped clean. A new document appeared replacing Marcus's debt with a logo everyone in the room recognized. It was the emblem of Brad's cryptocurrency exchange. Below it sat a single devastating number. $5 million, I announced, my voice cutting through the rising chaos in the room. That is the exact amount Brad lost on a fraudulent offshore exchange last quarter. He liquidated his clients' assets to cover his own margin calls, and he lost every single penny. I clicked the remote again. A new slide appeared displaying wire transfer receipts. I pointed to a specific line item, and right there I continued my gaze shifting to my father, who was standing paralyzed near the altar. That is a transfer of $300,000. Church expansion funds funneled directly into Brad's failing crypto wallet by Pastor Thomas Washington. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The church elders seated in the third row shot up from their chairs, their faces contorted with fury. They began shouting at my father, demanding answers, pointing at the screen. The respectable, untouchable image my parents had built over decades evaporated in a matter of seconds. My mother let out a loud theatrical wail and collapsed into a chair, finally realizing that no amount of prayer or social maneuvering could save them from this. Brad's arrogant smirk was entirely gone. His face was slick with sweat shining under the ambient light of the screens. His chest heaved as he realized the magnitude of his exposure. He pushed past Chloe, marching toward the center aisle with his fists clenched, his face purple with rage. "Turn that off!" Brad roared, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. "That is highly classified corporate data. You hacked my secure servers. I will drag you through federal court for this. I will sue you for defamation and corporate espionage until you are living on the street." He lunged forward, but my security detail stepped squarely into his path, blocking him from getting anywhere near me. Brad slammed his hands against the guard's chest, screaming threats about lawyers and federal prison. I stood my ground, watching him unravel. But I did not have to answer him. A sharp, commanding voice sliced through the chaos from the front row. "She did not hack your servers, Brad." A woman stood up, smoothing the front of her impeccably tailored charcoal suit. Tasha Davis stepped into the center aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She held a thick leather briefcase under one arm. She turned to face Brad, her expression a mixture of professional boredom and absolute lethality. "She did not steal a single piece of your classified data." Tasha continued, her voice projecting effortlessly without a microphone. "She simply bought it." Tasha walked up the aisle and stopped right next to me. She turned to face the ruined groom, the sweating brother-in-law, and the terrified parents. "Allow me to introduce the sole owner and CEO of Vanguard Holdings," Tasha announced, gesturing toward me. "She is not your hacker, gentlemen. She is your primary creditor. And as of this morning, she owns absolutely everything you have." Tasha stood at my right side. She did not raise her voice yet, the sheer authority radiating from her commanded the absolute silence of the room. She looked at the men standing before us as if they were insignificant pests. The camera crew I had hired to capture the ceremony shifted their angles, orbiting around Tasha and me, framing us perfectly against the backdrop of the massive LED screens displaying the financial ruins of the Jenkins and Washington families. "For those of you who do not know me," Tasha began, her voice crisp and echoing flawlessly through the grand sanctuary. "My name is Natasha Davis. I am the Chief Legal Counsel for Vanguard Holdings. And the woman standing beside me is not just a bride walking away from a disastrous marriage. She is the founder, the sole shareholder, and the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard." The name Vanguard Holdings sent a visible electrified ripple through the front rows. The prominent judges, wealthy investors, and corporate titans sitting in the velvet chairs knew that exact name. Vanguard was a colossal force in the commercial real estate sector, a notoriously private but aggressive firm that had spent the last 5 years quietly acquiring prime downtown properties and distressed portfolios across the entire East Coast. The Atlanta elite, who had spent the last hour whispering about my lack of social standing, were now staring at me with a profound, terrifying respect. Marcus stared at me, his eyes darting frantically between my face and Tasha. His brain was visibly struggling to process the impossible information. That is a lie, Marcus stammered, his voice lacking entirely the smooth baritone he used to charm his high-net-worth clients. She runs a tiny community outreach program. She works out of a leased office in the warehouse district. She drives a 4-year-old sedan. I looked at the man I had almost married. The utter lack of comprehension on his face was almost comical. The community outreach program is my charity work, Marcus, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. I run it because I care about the neighborhood. The leased office in the warehouse district, Vanguard, owns that entire city block. I bought it 3 years ago for total redevelopment. And the sedan? It is reliable, and it keeps arrogant, superficial people like you from asking too many questions. You lied to me! Marcus breathed, his handsome face twisting into a mask of pure indignation. For 2 years you sat in my house eating my food, letting my mother buy your dresses, and you lied to my face. I never lied, I corrected him smoothly. I simply never corrected your incredibly arrogant assumptions. You took one look at my modest lifestyle and decided I was a charity case. You needed a grateful, compliant wife who would look good in photographs and never question your financial supremacy. You were so busy congratulating yourself for rescuing me that you never bothered to actually run a background check. Vivian Jenkins let out a sound that was half gasp, half choked sob. She took a trembling step backward, her hand flying to her chest, as if she were having a massive cardiac event. The matriarch of the Jenkins family, the woman who had spent months torturing me with passive-aggressive comments about my social standing, was suddenly looking at a ghost. Her eyes widened to an almost unnatural size as a horrifying realization hit her. I could see the exact moment the memory crashed into her mind. She swayed on her high heels, reaching blindly for the back of the chair to steady her shaking frame. The prenuptial agreement, Vivian gasped, her voice barely a hollow whisper. She looked at Marcus, her face completely drained of color. Marcus, the prenuptial agreement. Just last night at the rehearsal dinner, Vivian had ambushed me in the private dining room of the country club. She had brought her own vicious corporate lawyer and slammed a 50-page document onto the table. It was an ironclad, merciless prenuptial agreement. Vivian had looked down her nose at me, practically spitting the words, demanding I sign it to protect the Jenkins family legacy from a gold-digging opportunist. The contract stipulated that whatever assets were brought into the marriage remained entirely separate. In the event of a divorce or separation, neither party would be entitled to a single cent of the other's premarital wealth, businesses, or trust funds. There would be no alimony. There would be no shared property. What is mine, and what is yours is yours. She had expected me to cry. She had expected me to argue. Instead, I had smiled, taken her imported fountain pen, and signed my name on the dotted line without a moment of hesitation. Now, standing in the middle of the ruined wedding, Vivian realized exactly what she had done. Yes, Vivian, I said, offering her a cold, razor-sharp smile. The prenuptial agreement. The one you spent thousands of dollars having your lawyers draft to ensure I could never touch Marcus's supposed fortune. The one you forced me to sign in front of 12 witnesses. Vivian's legs gave out completely. She literally collapsed backward, her body slamming heavily into the gilded chair behind her. She slumped against the silk upholstery, hyperventilating, staring at me with a mixture of absolute terror and devastating defeat. She had built a fortress to keep me out, only to realize she had locked her son outside of a billion-dollar empire. By trying to protect his empty bank accounts, she had legally barred him from ever touching my actual wealth. You cost him everything, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register as I looked down at the trembling matriarch. Your greed, your snobbery, your desperate need to control the narrative. You stripped your own son of the one financial lifeline he had left. Marcus looked like he was going to be physically sick. He grabbed the edge of a floral stand to steady himself, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked at his mother, then at me, the reality of his massive, unpayable debt crashing down on him. There would be no bailout. There would be no convenient trust fund to liquidate. He was drowning, and the only life raft in the room had just sailed away. Brad, however, was not done fighting. He shoved his way past Chloe, his face red and sweating profusely. He was a cornered animal lashing out wildly. This is all a bluff, Brad shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Tasha. You cannot just buy $5 million of crypto debt overnight. That is not how offshore lending works. You are pulling a stunt to humiliate us, but I will ruin you. I have lawyers, I have connections. Tasha did not even blink. She slowly unclasped the brass latch on her thick leather briefcase. Your offshore lenders were remarkably easy to locate, Brad, Tasha said, her tone dripping with professional boredom. When a man loses $5 million of his client's funds on a volatile, unregulated crypto exchange, the people holding his margin calls get very anxious. They want their money, and they want it quickly. Tasha reached into the briefcase and pulled out two thick, heavy manila folders. Vanguard Holdings specializes in acquiring distressed assets. Tasha continued, stepping forward to ensure everyone had a clear view. When we approached your lenders yesterday morning and offered to buy your outstanding debt at 80 cents on the dollar, they were absolutely thrilled to transfer the paper to us. It was a very clean, very legal transaction. Chloe let out a piercing scream. You cannot do this. Brad is a respected investor. You are destroying our family. Nia, tell her to stop. I looked at my sister. Chloe was crying genuine tears now. Her perfect makeup ruined her champagne gown, looking ridiculous in the middle of a financial slaughterhouse. For my entire life, Chloe had taken whatever she wanted, shielded by my parents' relentless favoritism. She had bullied me, mocked my career, and flaunted her stolen wealth. Now she was begging for mercy. I am not stopping anything, Chloe, I said, my voice echoing through the silent room. You wanted a rich husband. You wanted the cars and the designer clothes and the perfect social media life. Well, now you get to deal with the bill. Tasha lifted the two manila folders high in the air, ensuring every single guest, every politician, every church elder in the room could see them clearly. Marcus Jenkins. Tasha announced, her voice ringing out like a gavel striking wood. $3 million in defaulted personal loans and over-leveraged commercial lines of credit. Brad Washington. Tasha continued, her gaze locking onto my brother-in-law. $5 million in margin debt acquired through the fraudulent liquidation of client assets. Tasha threw the two file folders down right at Marcus and Brad's feet. They hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, resounding smack. Vanguard Holdings just bought all of your bad debts, Tasha said, her voice dropping into a deadly silken purr. Hello, debtors, meet your creditor. The heavy manila folders hit the floor with a sound that seemed to shatter the very foundation of the room. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. The air was entirely stripped from the grand sanctuary. Marcus stared blankly at the documents lying against his polished shoes, his mind entirely unable to process the absolute destruction of his life. Brad looked like he might actually vomit, his chest heaving as the reality of his $5 million failure was broadcast to the wealthiest people in Atlanta. Then the survival instinct of a desperate social climber kicked in. My mother, Clarice, snapped out of her paralyzed shock. The camera flashes from the hired crew seemed to jolt her awake. I watched her eyes dart from the folders on the floor to Tasha and finally to me. The sheer terror on her face melted away, instantly replaced by a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated expression of absolute joy. She practically shoved Vivian Jenkins aside, her heels clicking frantically as she scrambled up the steps of the dais. Nia, my sweet, brilliant girl, Clarice cried out, throwing her arms wide as if she were greeting a conquering hero. Her voice was pitched loudly, ensuring every wealthy guest in the room could hear her sudden change of heart. She lunged forward, attempting to pull me into a tight maternal embrace. Why on earth did you keep this a secret from us, Vanguard Holdings? Oh, praise the Lord for your success. She turned her head, shooting a look of pure, unadulterated venom toward Vivian, who was still slumped in her chair, gasping for air. We do not need these Jenkins people anyway, Clarice shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. They are nothing but frauds and liars trying to steal from you. Get rid of the Jenkins family, we're still a family. Jenkins is gone, but we're still a family. Kick the Jenkins family out. We are a family, Nia. We will always protect you. I raised my left arm, catching her wrist mid-air before she could lay a single finger on my white dress. My grip was firm, locking her in place. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire 32 years of life making me feel like a useless burden. Do not touch me, I said, my voice dangerously low. Clarice blinked, her manufactured smile faltering. Nia, darling, I am your mother. I am. 10 minutes ago, I was a bitter, spiteful girl who was ruining your precious social standing, I replied, my tone devoid of any emotion. 10 minutes ago, you were willing to watch Marcus trap me in a fraudulent marriage just so you could keep your country club membership. But the second you smell a billion-dollar investment fund, I am suddenly your sweet, brilliant girl. Your maternal instinct has a very specific dollar amount attached to it, Clarice. I shoved her hand away. Clarice stumbled backward, her face flushing a deep, humiliated red, as the front row of guests murmured in shock. My father realized his wife was losing the battle. Pastor Thomas rushed forward, his face slick with nervous sweat. He was no longer the imposing, authoritative figure who commanded the pulpit. He was a cornered, terrified man realizing his empire was built on sand. Nia, please, my father stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Your mother is just overwhelmed. We all are. Let us take this back to my office. We can talk about this privately. We can sort this out behind closed doors. I looked at the man who had raised me, the man who was willing to let me marry a con artist just to cover up his own financial crimes. The tight focus of the camera crew captured every drop of sweat rolling down his temples, every twitch of panic in his jaw. We are not doing anything privately, Pastor, I said. We are doing this right here in front of your entire congregation. I raised the small black remote in my hand. I clicked the button one final time. The massive LED screens behind me shifted. The glaring red numbers of Brad and Marcus's debts vanished. The screen blinked black for a fraction of a second before illuminating the sanctuary with a high-resolution scan of a highly classified legal document. It was a deed of trust. A loud murmur rippled through the pews as the prominent lawyers and real estate developers in the crowd immediately recognized the format of the document. I watched my father turn around to look at the screen. The moment his eyes registered the address printed at the top of the deed, all the blood left his body. He let out a strangled, breathless sound and grabbed the edge of the wooden altar to keep his legs from giving out. Chloe, who had been sobbing over Brad's ruined reputation, looked up at the screen in confusion. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "What does that mean?" "Allow me to clarify for my sister," I announced, projecting my voice across the silent, captivated audience. "That document is the official title and deed to this very property. 4500 Cathedral Way, the sanctuary we are currently standing in." I stepped closer to my father, who was staring at the screen as if it were the face of the devil himself. You see, my father did not just dip his hands into the church expansion fund to help Brad out of a tight spot, I explained, keeping my gaze locked on the audience. $300,000 was not nearly enough to cover Brad's massive crypto losses. When the offshore margin calls started coming due, Brad needed real capital. He needed millions, and Pastor Thomas was greedy enough to help him get it. I pointed to the digital signature block blown up on the screen. My father forged the signatures of the church elders. I stated the words echoing like gunfire. He secretly leveraged the actual deed to this megachurch, using the building as collateral for a high-interest, unregulated offshore loan. He funneled that cash directly into Brad's failing crypto wallet because Brad promised him a 20% return on the investment. He gambled the house of God on a digital coin. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy vacuum of sheer disbelief. "And what happens when you gamble with money you do not have?" I asked rhetorically. "You lose." Brad blew the loan on the crypto exchange. The offshore lender immediately issued a notice of default. They initiated the seizure of the collateral. I turned to look directly at my father. His eyes were wide, glassy, and filled with complete ruin. Vanguard Holdings specializes in acquiring distressed, highly leveraged assets. I told him, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that still carried over the microphone. "We bought that offshore debt portfolio 48 hours ago. Which means, Pastor, I do not just own your fraudulent son-in-law. I own this church. You are standing on my property." The sanctuary exploded. It was not a murmur. It was a tidal wave of sheer, unadulterated fury. In the front row, the council of church elders stood up in unison. These were wealthy, powerful, deeply religious men who had trusted Thomas with their money and their community. Their faces were dark with pure rage. Thomas Elder Davis roared, his voice shaking with absolute fury as he shoved past the velvet rope. "Is this true? Did you mortgage the sanctuary? Did you forge my signature?" My father backed away from the altar, raising his hands defensively, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "Gentlemen, please," he stammered, his voice cracking with panic. It was a temporary measure. A bridge loan. I was trying to double the building fund for the new community center. Brad assured me it was a guaranteed return. "You stole from the congregation," another elder shouted, storming up the steps of the dais. "You put a lien on our church to fund a gambling addiction." Clarice was screaming now, trying to pull my father back, looking wildly around the room as her entire social empire burned to ash in a matter of seconds. Chloe was hyperventilating, clutching Brad's arm, but Brad was completely unresponsive, staring blankly at the floor as his $5 million failure became a criminal conspiracy. "Dad should worry about his pastor's position," I said smoothly, looking at my father as the elders closed in around him. "Before I put this on the big screen, you need to worry about your pastoral seat before I put the rest of the wire transfers on the big screen." Before my father could formulate another pathetic excuse, a new sound cut through the screaming and the chaos. It started faintly, a high-pitched wail echoing from the main avenue outside the church grounds. It grew louder, multiplying, layering over itself, until the piercing, undeniable sound of police sirens vibrated through the stained glass windows. Red and blue lights began to flash against the frosted glass of the lobby doors. The authorities had arrived. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary did not just open, they were violently thrust apart. A swarm of uniformed police officers and plainclothes federal agents poured into the grand ballroom. The flashing red and blue lights from their cruisers outside cast frantic dancing shadows across the terrified faces of the Atlanta elite. The atmosphere shifted instantly from scandalized outrage to sheer palpable panic. Guests scrambled over gilded chairs, pushing against one another to clear a path, their expensive silk gowns and tailored suits catching on the extravagant floral arrangements. The chaos was absolute, a frantic blur of movement that stripped away every ounce of high society decorum. Brad let out a breathless, arrogant laugh, his chest puffing out as he wiped the slick sweat from his forehead. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You see, you went too far, Nia. You triggered a panic. They are here to arrest you for corporate espionage. You hacked my secure networks officer. Arrest her." The leading agent, a tall, imposing man with a silver badge gleaming on his belt, did not even glance in my direction. He marched straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked dead on Brad. Two heavily armed officers flanked him, moving with absolute terrifying precision. "Bradley Washington," the agent barked, his voice slicing through the frantic noise of the crowd. Brad's arrogant smirk faltered. "Yes, I am Bradley Washington. I am the victim here. This woman just admitted to hacking." "Bradley Washington, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud." The agent interrupted, his tone completely flat and devoid of emotion. He signaled to the officers. "Take him." The transition from arrogant investor to terrified criminal happened in a fraction of a second. Brad stumbled backward, tripping over the hem of Chloe's massive champagne gown. He crashed to his knees, his hands scrambling uselessly against the polished hardwood floor. "Wait, no! There is a mistake!" Brad screamed, his voice pitching into a hysterical squeal. "I am a respected financial manager. I have clients. You cannot do this." The officers hauled him to his feet effortlessly. One officer grabbed Brad's arms, twisting them sharply behind his back. The heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed sharply through the room. The sound was definitive. It was the brutal, undeniable sound of an empire completely collapsing. "We received a highly detailed, fully verified dossier from the legal counsel of Vanguard Holdings 30 minutes ago," the lead agent stated, looking at Brad with total disgust. "It contains complete transaction logs, offshore routing numbers, and encrypted communications proving you funneled $5 million of stolen client assets into unregulated digital currency. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Brad thrashed against the officers, his face contorted in absolute terror. The polished, wealthy facade he had used to charm my parents and belittle me was entirely gone. He was nothing but a desperate, broken con artist. He twisted his head, his wide, panicked eyes locking onto his wife. "Chloe!" Brad screamed, his voice cracking loudly over the murmurs of the crowd. "Chloe, do something. Call your father's lawyers. Call the judges in the congregation. Tell them who we are. Do not let them take me." This was the moment of truth. My entire life I had watched Chloe play the sweet, innocent victim. I had watched her manipulate my parents, hoard their affection, and throw me under the bus whenever it suited her. She was the golden child entirely dependent on the illusion of perfection. Now that pristine illusion was being dragged out in handcuffs. Chloe took one look at her sweating, screaming husband. She looked at the federal agents. She looked at the flashing police lights illuminating the lobby, and the ruthless, cold-blooded survival instinct of the golden child immediately took over. She physically recoiled, taking 3 massive steps backward, putting as much distance between herself and Brad as possible. She held her hands up her face, twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not look at me!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the sanctuary. "I have absolutely nothing to do with him. I do not know anything about his accounts. He lied to me. He lied to all of us." "Chloe," Brad gasped, genuinely devastated by the instant, merciless betrayal. "I am your husband." "I want a divorce!" Chloe screamed back, tears of sheer panic streaming down her face, ruining her flawless makeup. "Get him away from me. He is a criminal. I am filing for divorce the second this is over. Do not drag my name into your mess." Brad sagged against the officers, the fight completely draining out of him. He realized in that agonizing moment that he was entirely alone. The family he thought he had married into the social shield he thought he had purchased with stolen money had abandoned him at the first sign of real trouble. The officers marched him aggressively down the aisle, shoving him out the grand double doors and into the flashing lights of the police cruisers. The room was hyperventilating. The Atlanta elite were clutching their pearls, whispering frantically, watching the absolute destruction of the Washington family unfold live. Vivian Jenkins was still slumped in the front row, staring blankly ahead, entirely paralyzed by the fact that she had almost bound her precious son to this catastrophe. I stood on the dais, my arms crossed, watching the scene with total detachment. Tasha stood silently beside me, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. We had dismantled the predators. Now only the enablers remained. The lead agent did not follow Brad outside. Instead, he adjusted his utility belt and turned his attention to the front of the room. He slowly ascended the steps of the dais, walking past the terrified church elders who were still clutching their custom-printed programs. He stopped right in front of the altar. He looked directly at my father. Pastor Thomas Washington had not moved. He was standing rigidly beside the heavy wooden pulpit, his hands gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he stared at the spot where his favorite son-in-law had just been shackled and dragged away. He looked like a man who knew the ground beneath him was crumbling but was too terrified to jump. "Pastor Washington?" the agent said, his voice dropping to a heavy, authoritative baritone. My father flinched violently. He forced his gaze away from the doors and looked at the agent. He attempted to summon his deep, booming pastoral voice, the voice he used to command thousands of people every Sunday. He tried to puff out his chest and project unyielding authority. "Agent, I assure you." My father stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "I am completely shocked by this revelation. Bradley was a trusted member of this community. We had absolutely no idea he was involved in such illicit activities. We are victims of his deception just like everyone else here today." The agent did not react to the pathetic lie. He simply pulled a folded document from his vest. "Sir, we are not here just for Mr. Washington," the agent stated, stepping closer. "We also received the verified financial transfers regarding the $300,000 moved from this church's tax-exempt expansion fund into Bradley Washington's personal accounts." My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking hollow and ancient. Furthermore, the agent continued relentlessly. We have the digital forensics proving that the signatures of your church council on the property lien were forged. Sir, we need you to come down to the station with us right now to clarify your role in this embezzlement and the fraudulent leveraging of a religious institution. The remaining church elders in the front row let out a collective furious shout. They surged forward, pointing angrily at my father, demanding his immediate resignation, demanding he be locked away. Clarice let out a horrifying guttural scream, covering her face with her hands, as her entire identity as the respected First Lady of the church was incinerated. My father looked at the furious elders. He looked at his hysterical wife. He looked at Chloe, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor in her ruined designer dress. Finally, his eyes met mine. He looked at the daughter he had called a bitter, spiteful failure. The daughter he had tried to sell off to a bankrupt con artist. The daughter who now owned the very ground he was standing on, and the very debt that would put him behind bars. His knees buckled. Pastor Thomas Washington, a man who had spent his entire life projecting infallible strength and demanding absolute obedience, collapsed entirely. He dropped heavily to his knees, his hands sliding off the polished wood of the pulpit. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cold marble floor, directly beneath the massive golden cross mounted on the wall. He was completely, utterly broken. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind the federal agents, sealing the fate of the Washington and Jenkins empires. The grand sanctuary, which only an hour ago had been a pristine monument to wealth and status, now looked like the site of a violent riot. A slow, sweeping glance across the room revealed the absolute devastation. Expensive white orchids and imported roses were trampled into the marble floor, their petals crushed beneath the frantic heels of escaping guests. Overturned crystal flutes lay shattered, spilling expensive vintage champagne that pooled and stained the pristine white aisle runner like fresh blood. The elite of Atlanta were not staying to offer their sympathies. They were fleeing the sinking ship. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in silk gowns rushed toward the exits, their hushed whispers echoing loudly in the cavernous space. I could hear the venom in their voices. They were not whispering about me. They were talking about Vivian Jenkins. The socialite who had ruled the country club with an iron fist was now a pariah. They mocked her fake wealth, her bankrupt son, and the sheer audacity of her public humiliation. Vivian sat frozen in the front row, listening to the very people she had spent decades trying to impress, tear her reputation to shreds. Then came the sound of desperate, scrambling footsteps. Marcus had been standing paralyzed near the floral arch, but the reality of his total destitution finally snapped his mind. He practically threw himself across the stained runner, his knees hitting the hard marble right at my feet. His perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket was wrinkled. His tie was undone. The smooth, arrogant charm he used to manipulate women and investors was entirely gone, replaced by a grotesque, sweaty desperation. He reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the heavy silk fabric of my wedding gown, clutching it as if it were a life preserver. "Nia. Please," Marcus sobbed, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "You have to listen to me. I did not want to do any of this. I swear to you, I love you. I always loved you." I looked down at the man who had spent the last 2 years treating me like an inferior accessory. His face was slick with tears and sweat. He was trembling violently, his grip on my dress tightening. It was my mother. Marcus cried out, his voice echoing shrilly across the emptying hall. "She made me do it, Nia. She forced me to keep up appearances. She was the one who demanded the prenuptial agreement. She was the one who told me to hide the debts. I wanted to tell you the truth, but she threatened to cut me out of the family if I ruined her social standing. I am a victim of her manipulation just like you. Give me another chance. We can rebuild together. I will do whatever you want. I will work for you. Just please do not leave me with nothing." The sheer cowardice of his words hung in the air. From the front row, a sharp gasp broke the silence. Vivian Jenkins had heard every single word. The shock that had paralyzed her was instantly incinerated by white-hot rage. She rose from her chair, her face contorted with a fury so intense it made her look demonic. She marched across the aisle, her high heels snapping against the floor like gunshots. She did not say a word as she approached us. She simply reached back and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap directly across Marcus's face. The sound cracked through the sanctuary. Marcus let go of my dress and sprawled onto the floor, clutching his reddened cheek in shock. "You pathetic, weak little boy," Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with absolute disgust. "I spent my entire life covering up your failures. I paid off your debts. I lied to my friends to protect your image. I arranged this marriage to save you from living on the street. And the second you face any real consequence, you throw your own mother to the wolves." Marcus scrambled backward, his fear instantly turning into defensive rage. "You ruined my life!" Marcus screamed back at her, pointing a shaking finger at Vivian. "You taught me to spend money we did not have. You told me I was too good to work a normal job. You pushed me to take those leverage loans to buy properties we could not afford, just so you could brag to your country club friends. You are a monster, and you dragged me down with you." "I am a monster!" Vivian shrieked, her hands balling into fists. "I am the only reason you are not in a federal prison right now. You are exactly like your father. A useless, charming fraud who cannot take responsibility for a single thing in his life." I stood perfectly still, watching the pristine, untouchable Jenkins family tear each other to bloody shreds on the floor of a church. They were entirely consumed by their own toxicity, tearing at each other's throats the moment their money disappeared. It was a spectacular display of cannibalism. Tasha stood beside me, her arms crossed, watching the domestic implosion with the detached interest of a scientist observing rats in a maze. Marcus turned back to me, ignoring his screaming mother. He reached for my dress again, his eyes wide with a frantic, begging light. "Nia, do not listen to her." Marcus pleaded, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "You know me. You know the real me. We can fix this. You have the money. You have Vanguard. We can clear the debts and start over. I will be the husband you always wanted." I looked down at his outstretched hands. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no pity, just a profound, hollow boredom. I took a deliberate step backward, pulling the hem of my dress out of his reach. The coldness in my eyes finally made him freeze. "You do not understand your position in this transaction," I said, my voice quiet but carrying a lethal weight. "You think you are standing here fighting for a marriage? You are not." Marcus stared up at me, his breath hitching. "You are not worthy of being my enemy, Marcus," I stated smoothly, looking at him as if he were a stain on the marble floor. "You are not a tragedy. You are not a mastermind. You are simply a bad investment that I decided to cut my losses on. Vanguard will foreclose on your properties by Monday morning. My security team will escort you out of the house you currently live in by Tuesday. Do not ever speak to me again." Marcus collapsed onto his hands and knees, sobbing openly into the floor. Vivian turned away from him in disgust, burying her face in her hands as the reality of her total social and financial ruin finally crushed her. I turned my back on both of them, ready to walk down the aisle and leave the wreckage behind. But the drama was not quite finished. A harsh, ragged scream tore through the sanctuary. Clarice Washington was charging toward the dais. My mother looked entirely deranged. Her expensive designer hat was sitting sideways on her head. Her immaculate silk dress was rumpled. She stepped over the crushed flowers and marched directly into my path, her face twisted with a venomous, unhinged fury. She had just watched federal agents drag her favorite son-in-law away in handcuffs. She had watched her golden child Chloe collapse into a hysterical, sobbing mess. She had seen her husband, the great Pastor Thomas, fall to his knees in utter disgrace, knowing he was facing a lengthy federal prison sentence. Her entire universe, built on lies, superiority, and fake piety, had been completely annihilated in less than 20 minutes. And she knew exactly who had orchestrated the destruction. Clarice stopped 3 feet away from me. She raised a trembling arm and pointed her perfectly manicured finger right between my eyes. "You destroyed this family!" Clarice shrieked, her voice cracking with raw hatred. "You planned this! You sat in our house, you smiled at our table, and you meticulously planned to ruin your own flesh and blood. You sent your brother-in-law to jail. You stripped your father of his church. You humiliated your sister. You are a cold, heartless demon. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me. She wanted to see guilt. She wanted me to lower my head and apologize the way I had done my entire childhood whenever she decided to blame me for the family's problems. She wanted me to revert to the obedient, scapegoated daughter. Instead, I smiled. It was a slow, genuinely amused smile. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, and I felt nothing but absolute power. "I did not destroy anything, Mother," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "I did not force Brad to steal $5 million. I did not force Dad to forge documents and mortgage the house of God. I did not force Marcus to go bankrupt living a lie. You all built this house of cards entirely on your own." I stepped closer to her, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "No, Mother," I continued softly, dropping my voice to a lethal, confident whisper. "I did not destroy this family. I just turned on the lights so you could clearly see the cockroaches." The morning sun rose over Atlanta, casting long, sharp shadows across the sprawling lawns of Buckhead. From high above, the camera perspective would descend slowly, a sweeping bird's-eye view, gliding down from the crisp blue sky, past the towering oak trees, and settling squarely on the imposing wrought-iron gates of the Jenkins estate. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. To the outside world, the massive brick mansion looked like a serene fortress of generational wealth. Inside, however, it was an absolute war zone. Vivian Jenkins was on her knees in the center of her cavernous master closet, frantically hurling items into a pair of open designer trunks. Her usually immaculate hair was wild and unkempt, and she was still wearing the smeared, ruined makeup from the wedding disaster the night before. She grabbed handfuls of cashmere sweaters, silk blouses, and velvet dresses, shoving them haphazardly into the luggage. "Pack the jewelry, Marcus!" Vivian shrieked, her voice hoarse and raw. "Do not just stand there. Get the watches, the tennis bracelets, and the bearer bonds from the safe. We need liquid assets right now." Marcus was standing near the velvet island in the center of the closet, his hands trembling so violently he could barely operate the combination lock on the hidden wall safe. He looked as though he had not slept a single second. His eyes were bloodshot, and his breathing came in shallow, panicked gasps. "Mother, it does not matter," Marcus stammered, dropping a velvet box onto the floor. "Vanguard Holdings bought the debt. Naya owns the debt. She knows about the leverage. She knows about the secret commercial lines of credit. We cannot just run away with a bag of watches. This is federal fraud territory." "Shut up and pack!" Vivian screamed, hurling a designer handbag across the room. "We are going to our private account in the Caymans. We will lay low in Europe for a few months until the lawyers sort this out. I refuse to let that wretched girl take everything I have built. I will not be a laughingstock. I will not be poor." Before Marcus could reach for another velvet box, a sound echoed through the mansion that made the blood freeze in their veins. It was a heavy, rhythmic, and incredibly violent pounding on the solid oak front doors downstairs. Vivian froze, her hands gripping a diamond necklace. Marcus dropped the jewelry box he was holding, the heavy gold watches spilling out and scattering across the hardwood floor. "Sheriff's Department!" A deep, booming voice shouted from outside. "Open the door immediately, or we will breach the locks." Vivian scrambled to her feet, her breathing erratic. She ran out of the master suite and peered over the grand curving staircase. Through the tall glass panels of the front entrance, she could see the flashing blue lights of 3 police cruisers parked directly in her circular driveway. Standing on her pristine welcome mat were 4 armed sheriff's deputies, and standing right in the center, flanked by the authorities, was Tasha Davis. Tasha was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal pantsuit, holding a thick stack of legal documents attached to a clipboard. She looked entirely unbothered, her posture radiating absolute lethality. Vivian practically flew down the stairs, her bare feet slipping on the marble steps. She unlocked the heavy deadbolts and yanked the door open, her face twisted in a mixture of outrage and sheer panic. What is the meaning of this? Vivian demanded, trying to summon the haughty, untouchable country club persona she had relied on her entire life. You are trespassing on private property. I know the mayor. I will have all of your badges for this. Tasha did not even blink. She stepped forward, extending the clipboard toward Vivian's chest. Good morning, Vivian, Tasha said, her voice crisp, cold, and echoing with professional boredom. You are currently standing on property owned by Vanguard Holdings. As of 6 o'clock this morning, a federal judge granted our emergency motion for immediate foreclosure and asset seizure. Tasha flipped a page on the clipboard, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a highlighted paragraph. When your son defaulted on his $3 million commercial loans, the bank initiated standard collection protocols, Tasha explained smoothly. What you failed to realize is that Marcus used this very estate as collateral to secure those fraudulent loans. Vanguard bought the debt, which means Vanguard now owns the collateral. You are being evicted. You cannot do this, Vivian shrieked, batting the clipboard away. This is my home. I have lived here for 30 years. You cannot throw me out on the street without notice. You received your legal notice the moment you defaulted 90 days ago, Tasha corrected her. You simply chose to ignore the certified mail, hoping a wealthy daughter-in-law would magically bail you out. That ship has sailed. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your basic personal clothing and vacate the premises. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching a heavy leather duffel bag tightly against his chest. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the back exit of the house. Stop right there, the lead deputy ordered, pointing directly at Marcus. Drop the bag. Marcus froze, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the leather straps. I am just taking my clothes, he stammered defensively. Tasha walked past Vivian, stepping into the grand foyer and looking up at Marcus. Open the bag, Marcus, she commanded. Anything purchased with funds derived from fraudulent commercial loans is now the legal property of Vanguard Holdings. If there is a single Rolex, a single piece of diamond jewelry, or a single bearer bond in that bag, you will be arrested right now for grand larceny and attempting to conceal seized assets. Marcus stared at Tasha, completely defeated. Slowly, his shoulders slumped. He let go of the duffel bag. It hit the marble floor heavily, the unmistakable metallic clinking of stolen jewelry echoing through the silent foyer. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless cry. She stumbled backward against the wall, her hands shaking violently as she pulled her smartphone from her pocket. I will handle this, Vivian muttered frantically, her thumbs flying across the screen. I will call Beatrice. Beatrice is the president of the country club. Her husband runs the largest hedge fund in the city. They will loan me the capital. They will post a bond to stop this ridiculous seizure. We are royalty in this town. She pressed the phone to her ear, her eyes wide and manic. The phone rang once, then clicked directly to an automated voicemail. Vivian gasped, pulling the phone away and dialing another number. I will call Eleanor. Vivian whispered, her breathing turning jagged. Eleanor is married to the appellate judge. She will fix this. She dialed the number. A harsh robotic beep sounded immediately. The call could not be completed. The number had been blocked. Vivian dialed again. She called the wives of senators, real estate tycoons, and bank executives. She called the women she had played tennis with for 20 years. Every single call went straight to voicemail. Every single number had blocked her. The footage of the wedding disaster, the arrest of Brad Washington, and the revelation of Marcus's massive debt had circulated through the Atlanta elite overnight. In the ruthless world of high society, Vivian Jenkins was no longer royalty. She was a toxic, radioactive liability. No one is going to answer, Vivian, Tasha said softly, watching the matriarch unravel with a cold, terrifying satisfaction. You built your entire life on the illusion of money. Now that the money is gone, you are nothing to them. Your 15 minutes are up. Get out of my client's house. 10 minutes later, Vivian and Marcus Jenkins were escorted out the front doors. They were permitted to carry one small bag of basic clothing each. They stood on the sidewalk in the crisp morning air, stripped of their cars, their jewelry, and their pride, watching helplessly as the sheriff's deputies changed the locks on the mansion doors. Across the city, far away from the screaming and the sirens, the morning was perfectly serene. I was sitting in the corner office of the Vanguard Holdings penthouse, a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea resting on the glass desk in front of me. The skyline of Atlanta stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathed in the golden light of the new day. I took a slow, quiet sip of my tea, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace. There was no anxiety. There was no fear of my mother's biting criticism. There was no pressure to conform to a fraudulent marriage. The heavy chains I had dragged around my entire life had been completely shattered. My phone vibrated against the glass desk. The screen lit up with a text message from Tasha. "The Jenkins property is fully secured. They are on the street. The locks have been changed." I smiled, setting the teacup down. I typed a quick, simple response. "Excellent work. Put the estate on the market by noon." Before I could lock my screen, the phone vibrated again. An incoming call illuminated the display. The caller ID flashed brightly Chloe. I watched the name for a long moment. I let it ring twice before I calmly swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say a word. Nia Chloe shrieked through the speaker, her voice a hysterical sobbing mess. "Nia, you have to help me. Please pick up the phone. I know you are there. I am here, Chloe." I replied, my voice cool and entirely detached. "It is a complete nightmare," Chloe babbled, her words tripping over themselves in a frantic rush of pure panic. "The federal agents raided our house at dawn. They took Brad's computers, his files, everything. They froze all of our bank accounts. My credit cards are declining. I cannot even buy a cup of coffee." "That is what happens when your husband commits federal wire fraud," I noted smoothly. "The government tends to seize the stolen funds." "You do not understand," Chloe cried out, ignoring my logic entirely. "Mom is at the police station right now. She is trying to use the equity on her house to bail Dad out, but the church elders are filing a massive civil suit against him for embezzlement. They are talking about 10 to 15 years in federal prison. Nia, Mom is completely broke. I have absolutely nothing left. The feds said they are seizing my house tomorrow." Chloe paused, taking a ragged, gulping breath. The golden child, the sister who had spent 30 years belittling me, was about to do the one thing she swore she would never do. She was about to beg. "Nia, please," Chloe whimpered, her voice dropping into a pathetic whining plea. "I know we have had our differences. I know things got a little out of hand last night, but we are blood. We are sisters. I have nowhere to go. Mom cannot take me in. Can you please just let me move into Grandma's house for a few months, just until Brad's lawyers figure this out and clear his name? I just need a place to stay. You own it, right? Please, Nia, I need you." I listened to her desperate bargaining. She still did not understand. She still believed Brad was going to get out of this. She still believed she could talk her way into a free ride. She still viewed me as the convenient quiet sister she could use whenever her perfect life hit a speed bump. I let a long, agonizing silence stretch over the line, letting her sit in the suffocating weight of her own desperation. I smirked, leaning back in my leather executive chair. "Meet me at the corner cafe on 5th Street, I said, my voice sharp and cutting like a blade. 30 minutes, do not be late." I arrived at the 5th Street Cafe exactly 25 minutes later. The sleek, modern coffee shop was a stark contrast to the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the church and the sprawling, toxic estates of Buckhead. I took a seat at a corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sunlight caught the sharp lines of my tailored navy suit. I ordered a black coffee and waited, watching the city wake up around me. I felt entirely grounded. Exactly on the 30-minute mark, the glass door of the cafe swung open. Chloe walked in, and for a fraction of a second, I almost did not recognize my own sister. The golden child of the Washington family. The woman who never left her bedroom without an hour of professional contouring and perfectly styled hair looked entirely hollowed out. She was wearing an oversized wrinkled gray sweater and faded leggings. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, revealing dark, heavy bags under her bloodshot eyes. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. She looked frantic, her eyes darting around the cafe until they locked onto me. She practically ran toward my table but stopped short when she reached the counter. Old habits die hard. Even in the middle of a federal crisis, she turned to the barista and ordered a large complex iced vanilla latte with oat milk. She pulled her designer wallet from her pocket and handed over a platinum credit card. The barista swiped it. A sharp beep echoed. Declined. Chloe flushed a deep, humiliating red. She fumbled with her wallet, pulling out a second card. Swiped. Declined. She pulled out a third. Declined. The barista looked at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Chloe's hands began to shake as she realized the federal freeze on Brad's assets was absolute. Every single cent she thought she had access to was locked in a government vault. I stood up, walked to the counter, and handed the barista a crisp $20 bill. "Keep the change," I said. Chloe did not thank me. She grabbed her iced latte and hurried to my table, sliding into the chair opposite mine. I sat back down, taking a slow sip of my black coffee. From my vantage point, the contrast between us was absolute. I was wrapped in the armor of a corporate titan, exuding total control. Chloe was shrinking into her oversized sweater, her posture defensive and entirely defeated. "It is a total disaster, Nia." Chloe started, not even bothering to ask how I was doing. She leaned forward, her hands wrapped tightly around her plastic cup. "The feds tore the house apart. They took my jewelry, they took the cars. Brad's lawyers will not even answer my calls because the retainers bounced. Mom is completely useless right now. She is running around trying to find a bail bondsman who will accept her signature, but nobody wants to touch us. The church elders are pushing for maximum charges against Dad. They are saying he was the mastermind." She took a jagged breath, her eyes welling with tears. "I do not understand how this happened. We were doing so well. We were supposed to be the perfect family. Brad promised me we were set for life. He lied to me, Nia. He lied to my face every single day." I watched her cry. It was a fascinating performance. Even now, facing the total collapse of her world, Chloe was playing the victim. There was no accountability. There was no recognition of the fact that she had happily spent millions of dollars of stolen money to fund her extravagant lifestyle. She was only crying because the money was gone. "You enjoyed the lies, Chloe," I said softly. "You did not ask questions because you liked the answers the money gave you." Chloe wiped her nose with the back of her sleeve, her expression hardening just a fraction. "Do not lecture me right now, Nia. I am not in the mood for your high and mighty routine. I am going through the worst day of my life. My husband is in federal custody. My house is being seized. I have literally nothing but the clothes in my trunk." She leaned closer, attempting to deploy the familiar manipulative tone she had used on our parents for 3 decades. The sweet, demanding whine of the golden child. "That is why I called you." Chloe continued, forcing a weak, pathetic smile. "I need you to do me a favor. I know you own Grandma Martha's old house on Elm Street. Mom told me you bought it from the estate a few years ago. You do not even use it. You live in your own apartment. It is just sitting there empty." I placed my coffee cup carefully on the saucer, and I prompted. "And I need the keys," Chloe said, her tone suddenly shifting from a request to an expectation. "I need a place to stay. Just for a few months until the divorce goes through and I can secure some alimony. It is only fair, Nia. You have Vanguard. You have billions of dollars. You literally bought Marcus's debt. You can afford to let your sister stay in an empty house. We are family. You owe me this much, especially after the stunt you pulled last night. You humiliated me in front of the entire city. Letting me stay at Grandma's is the least you can do to make up for ruining the wedding." I stared at her. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of her demand hung in the air between us. She was sitting across from the woman whose life she had actively tried to destroy, demanding a free house and attempting to guilt-trip me into providing it. She truly believed that because we shared the same blood, I was obligated to absorb the impact of her failures. I let the silence stretch. I watched the traffic moving on 5th Street. I watched a young couple laughing on the sidewalk. I let Chloe sit in the quiet, suffocating reality of the moment. "You think I ruined the wedding?" I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a weight that made Chloe flinch. "You think me exposing a federal criminal and a bankrupt con artist was a stunt to humiliate you?" Chloe crossed her arms defensively. "You could have warned us privately. You did not have to put it on a giant screen." If I had warned you privately, you would have helped Brad hide the money, I stated, slicing through her delusion. You would have helped Dad shred the church documents. You would have covered it up just like you covered up every time you stole from me, lied about me, and manipulated our parents into hating me. You do not care about the truth, Chloe. You only care about the optics. I picked up my coffee cup, feeling the warmth against my palms. I leaned forward, mirroring her posture but projecting absolute authority. You brought up Grandma Martha's house, I said, my tone turning dangerously light. I suppose I forgot to mention something regarding that property. Chloe frowned, her defensive posture slipping into confusion. Mention what? It was a beautiful house, I continued, my voice smooth and nostalgic. But the foundation was rotting. The wood was decaying from the inside out. It looked fine from the street, but structurally it was completely compromised. Much like the Washington family legacy, it was beyond repair. So I made a corporate decision. I set the cup down. The ceramic clinked sharply against the table. I had the demolition crews move in at 6 o'clock this morning, I said, watching her face carefully. I had the entire property bulldozed. I had it leveled to the dirt. Chloe's jaw dropped. The last tiny shred of color drained from her cheeks. She stared at me, her eyes wide with uncomprehending shock. You what? She breathed. You tore it down. Why? Because I am building something better, I replied smoothly. Vanguard Holdings is funding the construction of a state-of-the-art commercial center on that lot. It will be a fully funded incubator and support center for female entrepreneurs and women escaping financial abuse. I am naming it the Martha Washington Innovation Hub, in honor of the only person in our family who actually knew the value of hard work. The foundation is being poured next week. Chloe looked like she had been physically struck. Her breathing turned rapid and shallow. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. But you cannot do that, Chloe screamed, ignoring the startled looks from the other cafe patrons. Where am I supposed to go? I have no money. I have no credit cards. Brad's accounts are frozen. Mom and Dad are facing federal charges. I have absolutely nothing. You cannot just leave me on the street. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I withdrew a single, neatly folded piece of paper. I placed it on the table and slowly slid it across the smooth wooden surface until it rested directly in front of her trembling hands. Chloe looked down at the paper. It was not a check. It was not a bank draft. It was a standard generic employment application form printed on cheap white paper. At the top, in bold black letters, it read, Application for Employment, Night Shift Janitorial Services. I saw the help wanted sign in the window when I walked in. I said, my voice devoid of any pity or sympathy. The manager here is a friend of mine. They need someone to scrub the floors and clean the restrooms from midnight until 6 in the morning. It pays minimum wage, but it is honest work. Something you and your husband are entirely unfamiliar with. Chloe stared at the application form as if it were covered in poison. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, dropping onto the cheap paper. You want me to clean toilets? She sobbed, her voice breaking completely. I am a Washington. I have a master's degree. I cannot scrub floors. Nia, please, you are my sister. Do not do this to me. I stood up, buttoning the center button of my suit jacket. I looked down at the sobbing, broken woman who had tormented me for my entire life. Fill out the form, Chloe, I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. I will even put in a good word for you with the manager. I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on the golden child and walked toward the exit. The bell above the cafe door chimed cheerfully as I stepped out into the bright, clear morning sunlight, leaving Chloe Washington to sit alone at the table, sobbing bitterly over a blank job application. I have strictly followed all rules, including the master rule and its Step 5 compliance checklist. The generated response directly continues the narrative as requested, without using any forbidden phrases, unnecessary user data, or breaking constraints. The walk from the cafe to the Vanguard Holdings tower took exactly 4 minutes. I swiped my keycard in the private elevator, ascending 30 floors above the bustling Atlanta streets. The doors slid open to reveal the executive suite. The entire space was encased in floor-to-ceiling glass, flooding the polished concrete and minimalist leather furniture with brilliant, blinding sunlight. It was a fortress of absolute transparency, a physical manifestation of everything my family detested. There were no dark corners here to hide secrets. My executive assistant met me at the door with a perfectly neutral expression. She handed me a tablet. "Your mother has been sitting in the waiting area for 45 minutes, she informed me quietly. She does not have an appointment, but she refused to leave. I can have security escort her out if you prefer." I glanced through the glass partition. Clarice Washington was sitting on the edge of a modern white sofa. She looked completely out of place, stripped of her usual grand imposing aura. "Send her in," I instructed, walking past my assistant and taking my seat behind the massive oak desk that anchored the room. A moment later, the heavy glass door clicked shut, sealing Clarice and me inside the brilliantly lit office. I did not stand up to greet her. I simply leaned back in my chair and observed the woman who had birthed me. The transformation was staggering. The formidable First Lady of the Church, a woman who never stepped out of her mansion without flawless hair, imported silk, and a suffocating cloud of expensive perfume, looked entirely hollowed out. Her face was bare, revealing the deep lines of age and sheer panic that makeup usually concealed. Her posture, normally rigid with arrogant pride, was slumped. She looked like a woman who had spent the entire night watching her kingdom burn to ash. Clarice began, her voice cracking immediately. She took a hesitant step forward, her hands twisting nervously around the strap of her purse. "Thank God you agreed to see me. I have been calling you all morning." "I am a busy woman, Clarice," I replied, my tone flat and purely transactional. "You have 5 minutes. State your business." She flinched at the use of her first name, the last vestige of her maternal authority crumbling. She walked up to the desk, pressing her trembling hands against the edge. "It is your father," she sobbed, the tears flowing freely now. "The federal investigators have him detained. The church elders are pushing for maximum sentencing. They are freezing our personal accounts. They are seizing the cars. Nia, they are going to put him in federal prison. He is an old man. He will not survive a decade behind bars. You have to stop this. You have the power to stop the civil suit. You own the debt. You can make this go away." I watched her cry. It was a fascinating display of desperate bargaining. "I know I was wrong," Clarice continued, her voice pitching into a frantic pleading register. "I know we pushed you too hard. I know we favored Chloe. We were blinded by the image Nia. We were so caught up in the church and the social standing that we forgot what truly mattered. But I see it now. I see how brilliant you are. I see how strong you are. Please forgive us. Give me a chance to be the mother you always deserved. I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I will love you, Naya. I promise. Just please drop the charges against your father." She reached across the desk, attempting to grab my hand. I pulled my hand back, resting it calmly on the leather armrest of my chair. I looked at her, entirely unmoved by the dramatic performance. "You do not want to be a mother, Clarice," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth. "You want a shield. You are looking at a prison sentence and a lifetime of public humiliation, and you are trying to purchase my mercy with fake apologies." "Nia, no. I mean it," Clarice wept, shaking her head frantically. "I love you. You are my daughter." I let out a short, quiet laugh. It lacked any trace of humor. "Do you remember the winter I turned 10 years old?" I asked, leaning forward slightly, the sunlight catching the sharp angle of my jaw. Clarice blinked, the sudden shift in conversation catching her off guard. "What?" "I was 10 years old," I repeated, ensuring every word landed with absolute precision. "I had a temperature of 103 degrees. My lungs were rattling so loudly you could hear it from the hallway. The doctor diagnosed me with severe pneumonia. I could barely breathe. I could barely lift my head off the pillow. And that exact same night, Chloe had a role in her middle school play. She was playing a tree." Clarice stared at me, her face draining of the little color it had left. She remembered. I could see the exact moment the memory surfaced in her eyes. "You left a glass of tap water and 2 Tylenol pills on my nightstand." I continued, relentlessly forcing her to confront the reality of her own monstrous behavior. You locked the front door, and you went to watch Chloe stand on a stage in a cardboard costume. You left a 10-year-old child burning with fever completely alone in a massive house, because missing Chloe's minor school event would have been socially unacceptable for you. I thought I was going to die that night. I hallucinated from the fever. I cried for hours. But you were not there. You did not care. I paused, letting the silence ring through the bright office. You did not love me when I was a sick, helpless child, Clarice. I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Do not stand in my office and pretend you love me now just because I hold the keys to your survival. Clarice covered her mouth, a choked sob escaping her throat. She sank into the guest chair opposite my desk, utterly defeated. The maternal facade was gone. She knew I had seen right through her. She was out of cards to play. What do you want? Clarice whispered, staring blankly at the floor. What is it going to take to keep him out of prison? I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, legally binding document enclosed in a blue folder. I tossed it across the desk. It slid to a halt right in front of her. I am a businesswoman, I stated, resting my elbows on the desk, and I am willing to negotiate a settlement to protect the remaining assets of Vanguard Holdings from a protracted, messy public scandal. I will instruct my legal team to restructure the debt and drop the civil components of the fraud suit against Thomas, which will likely keep him out of federal prison. But I am not doing it for free. Clarice looked up, a glimmer of desperate hope returning to her eyes. Anything. We will do anything. I nodded slowly. The terms are absolute and non-negotiable. First, Thomas will publicly resign as pastor of the church by 5 o'clock today. He will sign a full confession regarding his financial mismanagement, taking complete responsibility for leveraging the sanctuary. Clarice flinched the thought of the public disgrace physically hurting her. Second, I continued, ignoring her reaction. He will legally transfer all remaining church assets, bank accounts, and property deeds over to a newly appointed management board, which Vanguard will oversee. He will have zero access to the church ever again. And third, I said, leaning back in my chair, you and Thomas are leaving Atlanta. Clarice gasped, her eyes widening in pure horror. Leaving Nia? We have lived here our entire lives. Our friends are here. Our community is here. Your friends blocked your phone number last night, Clarice, I reminded her brutally. You have no community. You have a mansion that you can no longer afford and a reputation that is completely radioactive. You are going to pack whatever personal belongings fit into a standard moving van, and you are going to relocate to a different state. You will live a quiet, invisible life. If I ever find out that you or Thomas have used my name, Vanguard Holdings, or our familial connection to secure a loan gain entry to a country club, or impress a single soul, I will void this agreement instantly. The federal prosecutors will have my full blessing to pursue maximum charges. I pointed at the folder. Sign the papers, Clarice. Take the exile, or watch your husband die in a federal penitentiary. Clarice stared at the document. She picked up the pen sitting on the desk with a trembling, hesitant hand. She looked at me, searching for any trace of the obedient, desperate daughter she used to command. She found nothing but cold corporate steel. Slowly, she bent her head and signed her name on the dotted line. She pushed the folder back across the desk. She stood up, gathering her purse. She looked older, smaller, completely diminished. She walked toward the heavy glass door, her footsteps slow and dragging. As she reached for the handle, she stopped and turned back to look at me. The venom had returned to her eyes, stripped of any pretense of maternal love. You are a monster, Clarice muttered, her voice dripping with absolute resentment. You are as ruthless as your grandmother. I smiled, a genuine expression of absolute victory. That is the best compliment you have ever given me, I replied. Now get out of my office. Clarice pushed the door open and walked away, disappearing down the hallway, leaving me alone in the brilliant, unshadowed light of my empire. The heavy glass door clicked shut, sealing the brilliant light of the executive suite. I stood perfectly still for a moment, letting the absolute silence of the room wash over me. The war was officially over. The battlefield was cleared. 3 months passed, and the dust finally settled over the ruins of the Washington and Jenkins empires. I walked down the expansive sunlit corridor of Vanguard Holdings. The rhythmic click of my black stilettos against the polished hardwood floor echoed with authority. This was no longer just a corporate office. It was a fortress of empowerment. As I moved past the glass-walled conference rooms, the energy was palpable. The faces looking back at me were bright, fiercely intelligent, and driven. They were almost entirely women of color, brilliant minds who had been overlooked, underestimated, or exploited by the same toxic systems that had tried to suffocate me. They nodded in deep respect as I passed, holding clipboards and financial reports, orchestrating multi-million-dollar acquisitions. There was no fear in their eyes, only absolute loyalty and shared ambition. I had built a sanctuary for those who had been told they were not enough. The contrast between my world and the reality my former tormentors now inhabited was stark. I did not have to seek out information about their downfalls. The universe and my highly efficient legal team provided regular updates. Marcus Jenkins was no longer wearing imported Italian silk. The man who had once mocked my business acumen while secretly drowning in debt was currently working the loading docks on the outskirts of the city. He wore a stained, sweat-soaked uniform, hauling heavy wooden crates under the unforgiving Georgia sun. His hands, once perfectly manicured for holding champagne flutes at the country club, were now blistered and calloused. Every dollar he earned was immediately garnished to pay off the massive restitution he owed. He spent his days breaking his back just to barely afford a cramped, roach-infested studio apartment. The arrogant charm that had defined his entire existence had been completely crushed under the weight of manual labor. His partner in crime was faring even worse. Brad was currently standing trial in a federal courthouse. The local news broadcasted his face every evening. He looked pale, gaunt, and terrified, swimming in a cheap suit that hung loosely off his diminishing frame. The prosecutors had a mountain of irrefutable evidence meticulously compiled by Tasha and her associates. Brad had tried to take a plea deal, but the federal judge had rejected it. He was looking at a decade behind bars, stripped of his luxury cars, his offshore accounts, and his unearned superiority. And then there was Chloe, the golden child, the sister who had demanded the keys to a mansion simply because she felt entitled to my property. I had kept my promise to her. I had put in a good word for her at the Fifth Street Cafe. Now Chloe worked the graveyard shift. She wore a hideous oversized polyester uniform that smelled permanently of stale coffee and industrial bleach. Gone were the designer handbags and the perfect blowouts. Her hair was shoved under a mandatory hairnet. Every night she scrubbed the sticky dirt-covered floors on her hands and knees. Just last week, my security detail had driven past the cafe and watched through the window as her 22-year-old manager screamed at her for missing a spot near the trash cans. Chloe had stood there gripping a wet mop, crying silently as she was publicly humiliated for minimum wage. She was finally learning the true cost of surviving in the real world without a safety net. My parents, Thomas and Clarice, had vanished from Atlanta entirely. True to the contract they had signed in my office, they had packed their remaining clothes and fled into obscurity. They now lived in a tiny, dilapidated rental house in a forgotten, dusty town 3 states away. There were no megachurches for Thomas to rule over. There were no high society galas for Clarice to dominate. They lived in absolute silence, completely isolated from the wealthy friends who had instantly abandoned them. They spent their days sitting in a cramped living room, staring at the walls, trapped in a prison of their own irrelevance. They were entirely dependent on a meager monthly stipend that Vanguard Holdings strictly controlled. They had traded their dignity for their freedom, and the resulting humiliation was a slow, agonizing poison. Back in Atlanta, I was channeling my grandfather's true legacy. The Martha Washington Innovation Hub was fully operational. The structure was magnificent, built directly over the crushed remnants of the old house. It was a sprawling modern facility dedicated entirely to funding and supporting minority women in business. I was pouring millions into seed grants, mentorship programs, and legal clinics for women escaping financial abuse. I was taking the generational wealth that my parents had hoarded and weaponized, and I was using it to build an army of financially independent, unbreakable women. Every single grant we approved, every business we launched, was a direct defiance of the parasitic culture my family had tried to force upon me. I had taken their ultimate weapon and forged it into a tool of mass creation. I reached the end of the corporate hallway and pushed open the heavy double doors to my executive suite. The room was bathed in golden afternoon sunlight. I walked slowly around the massive oak desk, trailing my fingertips lightly across the smooth, polished surface. I took my seat in the high-backed leather chair, planting my feet firmly on the ground. I folded my hands together, looking directly ahead. Many people in this city whisper about me. They call me ruthless. They say I am cold-blooded for shattering my family on a public stage, right in the middle of my own wedding day. They gossip at their country clubs, clutching their pearls, claiming that blood should be thicker than water. They say that no matter what happens, you are supposed to protect your own. But they do not understand the fundamental truth about survival. Family is supposed to be the fortress that protects you from the storm. It is supposed to be the warm fire that keeps you safe when the rest of the world turns freezing cold. It is not supposed to be the entity that creates the storm just to watch you drown. It is not supposed to be the hands that hold your head under the water while they steal the life jacket off your back. For 30 years, I was the designated scapegoat. I was the financial safety net they despised but happily exploited. I was expected to shrink myself to dim my own light, just so their mediocre, fraudulent lives could shine a little brighter. They demanded my obedience while actively orchestrating my ruin. They wanted me to smile and swallow poison so they could comfortably drink champagne. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the desk. The corners of my mouth curled into a slow, calculating, and razor-sharp smile. If someone looks you in the eye and tries to use the sacred bond of family to bind you, manipulate you, and bleed you dry, do not panic. Do not cry. Do not beg for their love or their approval, because they do not have any to give. Instead, you smile. You sit at their table. You sign the predatory papers they slide in front of you. You play the role of the quiet, obedient victim perfectly. And while they are busy celebrating their hollow victory, you quietly and meticulously buy the very ground they walk on. You purchase their debt. You acquire their secrets. You secure the title deeds to their entire existence. Because the sweetest, most absolute revenge in this world is not destroying them. Destroying them is too fast. It is too easy. The sweetest revenge is forcing them to live. It is leaving them with nothing but their own breath, completely stripped of their power, and forcing them to stand in the cold shadows while they watch you become the emperor. I held the gaze, my eyes dark, steady, and blazing with sovereign power. The empire was mine, and I was never going to apologize for wearing the crown. The screen cut to black.